Words. They're just words. In Turkey, President Erdogan uses words to describe journalists he doesn't like. He calls them ignorant, agents of subversion, foreign spies, terrorists. Hundreds of writers and journalists in Turkey have been arrested and detained without charge or are awaiting trial. Words. In China, censors simply delete the ones they don't like. President Xi Jinping told writers and artists they should work toward promoting party ideology. Nobel laureate Liu Xiaobo penned 7 sentences. He was arrested for his words and died in state custody. Words. Ukrainian filmmaker Oleg Sentsov criticized the Russian government. Iranian lawyer Nasrin Sotoudeh spoke out in defense of dissidents. They were imprisoned. Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi wrote about repression in the Middle East. He was tortured and murdered inside the Saudi Arabian consulate in Istanbul. Words. Asked how the government might handle journalists who did not stick to the official line, Thailand's Prime Minister General Prayut Chan-o-cha used words, "We'll probably just execute them." In Mexico, Ruben Espinosa, Anabel Flores Salazar, Javier Valdez Cardenas, Juan Carlos Huerta, and more than 100 other writers and journalists have been murdered for their words. Words. They're just words, and ideas, and films, and songs, and stories, and research, and internet postings. And PEN America's been advocating for them and their authors around the world for almost a century, in countries like Russia, Egypt, Colombia, Bangladesh, and Eritrea. Countries where words are not free, and free thinkers are in danger. So when the President of the United States calls journalists the enemy of the American people, or says a news organization is going to suffer the consequences, or threatens to use the machinery of government to exact reprisals, when he puts arts and humanities on the chopping block and denies the meaning of words, it reminds us of other words from other leaders and leads us to raise the question, can it happen here? And raise the alarm, it can happen here. Because these aren't just words we're fighting for. They're the lifeblood of our freedom. Words transcend borders and drive our curiosity. They're how we share, understand others, tell stories, and come together. Words allow us to know. They allow us to wonder, to kid, to joke, to celebrate, to love. Words are truth, and they deserve protection. Protection in Myanmar, in Mexico, in Russia, in Turkey, in Saudi Arabia, and right here in the United States. We need to be strong for words, and to be strong, we must come together. PEN America, louder, together.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Stump, and I'm the Director of Membership here at PEN America. Thank you all for being here this evening for what is sure to be a very strong discussion. You may recognize me from the monthly member newsletter where you find your updated news and activities that you can take part of as a member of PEN America. If you haven't had the chance to meet me yet, please stop after the event tonight and shake my hand. I'd love to meet you. My role here at PEN America is to be your link as members within the organization, to make sure that the connection is strong and to continue to build our membership, because that is where PEN America's strength lies. As writers, as translators, editors, publishing professionals, and others from the literary community, and as readers and as allies, PEN America members stand strong against potent challenges to free speech and for press freedom and the right to dissent and the open flow of information. This is why PEN America membership, the participation of each and every one of you, is more important than ever. We're excited to welcome all of our members joining us this evening via the live stream. In addition to the audience Q&A at the end of the evening, we'll be taking questions via Twitter. I'd like to start the evening by introducing Jennifer Egan, who currently serves as the president of PEN America. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer.
Thank you so much to all of you for coming tonight. And it is my privilege to serve as president of PEN America. Just finished my first year. When I talk about our mission at PEN America, it can sometimes sound like two separate missions, celebrating creative expression and defending the liberties that make it possible. Last week's Literary Awards was a reminder of why these two elements are in fact inseparable. Literary expression at its finest, in addition to providing transporting and compulsive reading, embodies hard truths, contradictions, and discoveries that push the reader in new directions, sometimes outside her comfort zone. The daring and groundbreaking work we honored last week at the awards is testament to a culture in which free expression is nurtured and protected. It is a privilege. PEN America's fight on behalf of writers and journalists who are being silenced around the world is one aspect of our insistence upon the value of literary culture and the complexities of thought and expression it engenders. That complexity is essential to a healthy democracy, and we will fight against encroachments upon it wherever and whenever we see them. So to start with our election results, PEN America's officers and trustees are voted for by PEN America professional members in good standing. And for the 2019 election, we received a total of 257 ballots from members voting by proxy. And the results are as follows. Elected officers to the board: Marcus Dola as Executive Vice President, Masha Gessen as Vice President, Tracy Higgins as Vice President, and Yvonne Marsh as Treasurer. Andrew Solomon has been elected for a third term on PEN America's board. And now elected for their second term on the board are Ayad Akhtar, Gabriella De Ferrari, Elizabeth Hemmerdinger, Sean Kelly, Yvonne Marsh, and Alexandra Monroe. And elected for a first term are Bridget Coleman, Patricia Philly Crucial, Min-Jin Lee, Franklin Leonard, Marvin Putnam, Alex Ritchie, and Jamie Wolf. All right, now for our State of the Union. Sounds very grand. 2018, I'm happy to say, was our biggest membership growth year on record, with 2,162 new PEN America members. This was largely due to our unification with the former PEN Center USA based in Los Angeles, and we are so happy about that unification. And I know when I made this speech last year, we had one state that was a holdout. It was one of the Dakotas. We now have members of PEN America from all 50 states. Someone heeded the call. We've expanded our nationwide work as part of our PEN Across America initiative and its cornerstone, the Press Freedom Incentive Fund. We've supported projects in more than 25 cities and regions in the last year, conversations around fact-based journalism in the age of polarization, trust and transparency in the newsroom, the telling of stories of immigration and marginalization. And tonight, we are thrilled to have in our audience 8 PEN America supporters who have been working on these sorts of activities, hailing from Atlanta, Birmingham, Cincinnati, Dallas, Denver, Tulsa, and North Kentucky. They are all partnering with us to celebrate literary excellence, defend a free press, and protect journalists in their communities. And we are thrilled to have them here. And we're also eager to hear from you about how we can best support other communities across the country. And as we expand, we are also advocating at the state and federal levels around proposed legislation that has free expression implications. And our efforts include petitions and sign-on letters, social media campaigns, and direct advocacy with elected officials, and not surprisingly, having a nationwide network of members to call upon strengthens these efforts enormously. So it all sort of fits together. It has been a delight and a pleasure to work with our Los Angeles office, formerly PEN Center USA, which we united with just a year ago, They have their own gala in LA, which was a lot of fun. We honored Ai Weiwei and Barry Jenkins, among others, last November. And Los Angeles continues its Pen in the Community programming, and in January inaugurated the LA debut of the New Year New Books Party and the 2019 welcome party for the Emerging Voices Fellowship, which is an LA-specific program that provides underrepresented writers with the tools they need to pursue professional careers. Highlights of the upcoming year in LA public programming will include the Penn Presents Conversation series, focused on page-to-screen adaptations, and LA's own private author evening series, Penn World Voices Festival pop-up, and a monthly book club, among others. Many of you know that on October 16th, 2018, PEN America filed a First Amendment lawsuit in federal court that seeks to stop our president from using the machinery of government to retaliate or threaten to retaliate against journalists and media outlets for news coverage he dislikes, because it is illegal to do that. We filed an amended complaint in the last month and are now preparing for upcoming court appearances to argue on behalf of our members who have been affected by the president's threats and actions. We will keep you posted. PEN America's online harassment field manual is a first-of-its-kind digital toolkit that equips writers with the strategies and resources to defend against online harassment, a growing problem, to be sure. This past summer, we rolled out the field manual trainings in newsrooms and journalism schools across the country, and we will continue to do that. PEN America's work in support of writers and journalists persecuted and imprisoned around the world does not always result in uplifting stories. But in the past few months, we've celebrated the release of 2 individuals on whose behalves we have advocated strongly: the Egyptian writer Ibrahim al-Husseini and Turkish artist and activist Zehra Doğan, who was released just last week. So we're very pleased about that. And we continue to advocate and fight on behalf of more than 50 other imprisoned and persecuted writers around the world. Last Tuesday, we held our annual PEN America Literary Awards, which is the culmination of a year-long program of submissions and judging. And with the help of our partners, we gave away over $370,000 in prizes for more than 20 distinct awards, including a new award for excellence in writing and performance. Excellence in writing for performance, named in honor of iconic director Mike Nichols and sponsored by Lorne Michaels. And the ceremony this year, I have to say, was a lot of fun. We had an excellent host and amazingly winning speeches, every one of which managed the elusive feat of being moving, eloquent, and brief. It was really something. The PEN America World Voices Festival will return this May with over 70 events, amazing writers, all gathered under the theme of open secrets. The incomparable Arundhati Roy will deliver the Arthur Miller Freedom to Write lecture at the Apollo Theater on the last night. And writers and public figures such as Tara Westover, Marlon James, the Reverend William Barber, Majian, Sonia Sanchez, Juan Felipe Herrera, Dave Eggers, Kara Swisher, Tommy Orange, and many more will explore the blurring line between the public and the private in our literature, our politics, and our daily lives. So please join us for that. It will be great. Our four-decade running prison and justice writing program continues to work on a national scale, bringing free writing resources to incarcerated people and amplifying their words to reach new audiences. And we have our first physical publication of the winner's work and his beautiful volume. And of course, another event coming up is the PEN America Literary Gala. We are honored to present the Publisher Award to Richard Robinson, CEO of Scholastic, and the Literary Service Award to the legendary presidential chronicler Bob Woodward. And in just a few days, we will also be announcing our 2019 Penn Barbie Freedom to Write Award and launching a new campaign to call for the freedom of the recipients. And John Oliver will be our Master of Ceremonies. So that is going to be a fun night, and more information to come on presenters and other attendees. If you're interested in attending, please pick up more information at the check-in table on your way out. And now to wrap up and get on to the panel, which I know we're all looking forward to, I want to thank our tireless community members who are working on specific programs, causes, and special interests. And those committees include the Children's and Young Adult Books Committee, the Translation Committee, Writers in the Schools Committee, Prison Writing Committee, LA Committee, and Literary Awards Committees. If you are a member of one of our committees, can you please stand up? With all those committees, we must have a few here. Thank you so much for your work. Since 1922, the PEN America community has united writers and their allies to celebrate creative expression and defend the liberties that make it possible. You are all part of that history. Please refer your literary friends and your reading friends for membership. And thank you all for coming out tonight to support each other and for your commitment to PEN America and for reminding us with your accomplishments of why our work matters. And now I would like to introduce our Chief Executive Officer, Suzanne Nossel.
Where you're all situated. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. I want to welcome you all to tonight's discussion. We have a large and distinct panel, and rather than reading everybody's bios, you all have it in your programs. I'm going to refer you to that where you can see how each of our panelists first to be described. I just want to welcome tonight Ayad Akhtar, Ian Baruma, Moon Han, Wesley Morris, Meredith Townsend, and Francine Prose. So until a few years ago, the PEN America Annual General Meeting involved a few folding chairs set up in the office and different members of staff to brief on what they'd accomplished over the last year. It felt very much like a meeting set up to fulfill a bylaws requirement. So 2 years ago, we decided to mix it up and use the occasion of the AGM to convene an essential conversation on issues affecting our community. That first year, we took on the role of the writer across America. Last year, it was Me Too, a writer's reckoning. We tried each year to bring together a wide range of views, take up conversations that are ranging in Twitter feeds, Facebook posts, and op-ed pages, but that very often can involve each of us talking to family members, friends, maybe colleagues, people who tend to agree with us. We share our outrages, our indignation, a pithy quote or snippet of video that proves our point. We know that our associates will nod, talk over, retweet, and like. When we read of incidents or accounts with which we disagree, our blood pressure goes up. We may be tempted toward snippy rejoinder, parody, or detailed rebuttal. But amid all of this, what's relatively infrequent is direct, face-to-face, reasoned conversation with those with whom we disagree. We may not know people who disagree with us. We may not want to go there because it's too fraught or stressful. We may feel the conversation is pointless. But at PEN America, we really believe the conversation isn't pointless. Because we believe that alongside what we disagree on, there are things that we can agree on. And we believe the exercise of teasing out those differences and those commonalities is an essential one. Tonight, I'm sure we're going to manage to offend somebody. It'll probably be the end of it. So I'll just apologize preemptively on our collective behalf for that. Because tonight we try to bring together writers who have commented on all sides of today's debates over representation, appropriation, political correctness, call-outs, and culture wars. Our jumping off point in many ways is Wesley Morris's October 2018 essay in New York Times Magazine, Should Art Be a Battleground for Social Justice? That probes many of these questions. So with that, I want to launch right in. Wesley, you've written about the challenge of having an honest, critical response to creative work that represents a breakthrough in terms of representation. TV shows by African American women, books on transgender see such work as too rare to dislike. Can you elaborate on this?
Sure. I mean, things have changed. Things are changing. I think that there's a degree to which there's some uncertainty about whether things are changing fast enough when it comes to who is represented and accounted for in given media and certain. And I think you're their microphone. But I do think, okay, so anecdotally, this is probably the best way. Right? You in my life, I spent a lot of time taking in all kinds of popular culture and there's a hunger that you want as a consumer of these things. Not just I'm talking specifically as a civilian consumer. There's a desire that you have to want to see some aspect of a person that you are, the person you are, reflected in some way, some acknowledgement. That I'll speak for myself. I, as a black man, as a person who grew up poor, I don't know. You want to see a world that in some ways corresponding with. You want to see art that in some ways corresponding with the world. And at some point, the other thing that you want as a consumer of that work is for it to be taken seriously and treated seriously as a work of art or as a work of culture. And so the thing that I was noticing in my social life, in various sort of secondhand, indirect conversations that were happening in social media, and just the way, like an aspect of either the critical apparatus or the discursive apparatus called like brunch around culture was happening was pretty easily, well, not easily. It tended to fall into like a bucket of I'm glad this thing exists. And the fact that we have it is reason enough to deem it good. And the secondary question of whether the thing is good or what is actually in the thing was secondary. And I think I don't know if I'm establishing the thing that I wrote for you guys. And the sort of central tension, which is, I mean, I don't know how much of a tension it was. I really just wanted to get out this idea that there's been a shift. And the shift is important, but I wanted to mark the shift first.
So Ingrid, you took on Leslie's piece. You wrote in the piece, we're talking less about whether work is good art, but simply whether it's good for us, good for the culture, good for the world. You, I think, took issue with this. In your view, if art is good for us, good for the culture, and good for the world, doesn't matter if experts and critics don't actually think it's good.
I think
I didn't put it.
I think a lot of these that representation are about power, because it's a lot of ways a much more consumer oriented or reader or audience oriented type of conversation. So I guess I think it's productive to have conversations about like what type of conversation even in this case, I feel like that type of discourse is not really like recognized as such, because I feel like it's being censorship or self-censorship. But I think it's just people trying to figure out how they want to feel about a certain thing. I don't know if that was lucid.
No, I understand. Can I just I understand that. I would say that the sorting out how to have these conversations was sort of one of the things I was trying think, imprinted that, and the ways in which there seems to be a struggle about how, I mean, a struggle based on conversations I've had with people. A lot of, I mean, and I'll be honest about this, I would say half those conversations have been with white men who struggle with writing about non-white culture, right? And whether or not they can do that, and what happens if they do it and get it quote wrong. And then the other half really is non-white people. I mean, it is non-white, non-straight people trying to figure out how to dislike a thing.
Do you want me to call him?
All right, Francine, I want to bring you in. You became sort of subject to some controversy. You pointed out some striking similarities between a short story published in the New Yorker by the writer Sadia Shepard that bore marks of a story that had been published in the New Yorker years earlier by Mavis Galat. And you were accused of failing to appreciate that Shepard's indication of key elements of the fireworks plot and characters, but her decision to situate them in a different geography with different racial and ethnic identities at work constituted what some saw as perfectly valid and positive and laudable act of literary homage. Instead of Canadians in Geneva, it was Pakistanis in Connecticut in Shepard's story. So you called her out, then you were called out. And I'm curious sort of what you make of this conversation based on perhaps that experience and other experience, whether you think that how we react to a story or a piece of literature should be framed or inflected by these questions of representation, and whether the validity of that story should be evaluated on that basis or on another basis.
Well, it was an unpleasant experience.
Just push the
Just push. It's on now?
Yes.
It was an unpleasant experience. I mean, I have to say that I really come to despise the phrase call out. Because I think that we live in a culture, a larger culture than our people culture, is a culture that's based on bullying and based on intimidation and based on incivility. And that in a way, it's as if we're living in a time of place. And it's our responsibility as writers and people of consciousness, language and tone, almost to get up every day and examine ourselves as if we were living in playtime and say, how much are we affected by this play? How much is it,
What's the play?
The play is nastiness and bullying. And as I said, it's really, I'm gonna list this differently, I think this. And in the way that you would look for physical manifestations of the play, I think that each of us have to look for moral and psychic manifestations of the climate in which we live. So when we talk about call out, which does have an element of bullying, which does have an element of a kind of incivility, really. I mean, I think there are ways of saying, I disagree with this, I think it's wrong, I think there's another way of looking at this that has somehow gone out of our discussion. And we're all just hideously rude to one another quite often in the way that our president is rude to all of us and our government is rude to all of us. So one of the things, I mean, I'd sort of rather not rehash the questions of this story in the New Yorker, but what I do want to talk about is the tone in which the discussion goes, which is really appalling. Because, and this has happened, again, we could have talked about self-censorship. I think one of the reasons that people are more or less and less likely to speak out about things they believe in is because the fear of being loaded online and so forth is profound and real.
I wonder if there's anyone on the panel who wants to speak in favor of call-out culture. Meredith?
I'm not sure if I necessarily want to speak, unequivocally in favor of call-out culture. I do think that I do feel like there are a lot of instances in which people are unjustly accused or people are, sort of end up on other hand, you know, we do have to recognize that we live in a culture where minorities are often sort of discrimination behind closed doors, you know, within institutional settings where people don't have to call out in order for, you know, in order for people to, in order for instance, trans people of color to be prevented from having educational opportunities, or for, you know, and for people who are various minority identities to, you know, to have their views be, you know, be shut down. And so I think one of the things that I notice happening, right, is, and especially in a context where we don't, in America, we have deeply unequal access to education, right? So a lot of people from marginalized groups don't even feel like they have the ability to be able to disseminate their views in ways that would be heard by a large proportion of people unless they shout those views, right? You know, so I think of an instance, you know, one instance that comes to mind is, I don't know if people follow this, Genesis Gutierrez, who was an undocumented Latinx trans activist, interrupted in 2015 interrupted an LGBT reception that Obama hosted because she wanted to point out the injustice of incarcerated of people in detention centers, of trans people in detention centers. And I profiled her, and one of the things that she said was, as an undocumented Latinx, you know, activist, I had no choice. I had no other way to, you know, to be able to express my views except through this public forum.
I would also like to, I guess, defend call-out culture. Oh,
It's on, but maybe a little closer.
can you hear me better? I'm cursed.
Exactly. Find out.
Oh, you can hear me better, right?
Yes, better.
I'll try to talk more loudly. I feel like a lot of call-out culture, or what gets called call-out culture, is basically in the eye of the beholder, and whether you're basically the target of it or maybe a participant in it. I come from a film and TV production background, so I will take my examples like in that direction. But if we're talking about a movie like Green Book, for example, which is a movie that is basically
It's okay.
Sorry.
Just a breath.
okay,
Don't take it personally.
which is a movie about like a white man, or sorry, a white stripe of. It's a movie about the friendship between a white driver and a black musician, and it was obviously meant to be a very well-intentioned anti-racist movie. And people essentially got very mad at it, I think for very legitimate reasons. And those reasons really pertain to who gets to tell that type of story and what perspective they center. And I am sure that those filmmakers think that this is just call-out culture, this is some sort of ideological purity test. But I think a lot of the criticisms of Green Book, just to give one example, were really legitimate and took into consideration who gets to represent who, which are conversations that we are really not having enough. I think a lot of that has to do with who gets to be the gatekeepers or the greenlighters within culture. And basically, I think it's good that creators are forced to reckon with the fact that they don't just have the audience that they want, they have a very broad swath of an audience. And if some members of those audiences feel excluded or marginalized by the narratives that they tell, then maybe that's something that they should consider rather than dismissing as a sort of like, I don't know.
So the contention is that call-out culture is in the eye of the beholder, that one person's call-out culture is, you know, the other person's maybe Me Too movement, you know, that is galvanizing and empowering. You know, is there a boundary line that we can draw between sort of, what Meredith and Ingo are articulating, which is, that there can be some legitimate reason to draw attention to something, to use provocative tactics, perhaps if you're excluded or you don't have other means, or if you have a perspective that's different than that of what seems to be the intended audience. Is there a line between that and sort of the incivility and rudeness and sometimes cruelty that Francine's talking about? And I want to bring Ayad and Ian into the conversation, so I'll first turn to either of you if you want to come in on that.
Well, first of all, I haven't seen Green.
You're not missing it.
I think it's perfectly legitimate to criticize any work of art or any book or any film. I also think it's only for the good that as many people from as many different backgrounds, genders, sexual orientations and so on, get to speak and express themselves and create works of art and so on. Where I get nervous is when people get denounced for saying things that make people feel uncomfortable, or denounced for not having the right to express something because they are not from the background that should be expressing it. And no doubt because I grew up as a relatively privileged person, I did not necessarily always want to see things written or made by people who are just like me. On the contrary, I've spent my entire life craving things that show the lives and are expressed by people who are not like me. But again, that may be a reflection of my privilege. But I think how we should assess that is not who expresses something and what the background of that person is who expresses it, but as Wesley was saying, whether they get it right or wrong. So I think if a person, let's say a white person, writes a novel about a black character, the way one should then assess the work is whether it's plausible or not whether it's right or wrong that a white person should be writing about a black character in the first place. And so what I resist really is this idea that writers and artists and thinkers should be representatives of an ethnic group, a sexual orientation, or even a gender. I think that writers and artists and thinkers should be speaking for themselves. If it's legitimate for people, for example, somebody to assess a novel on whether it's somebody from a community that's being described in the novel, to assess it on the grounds of whether it's sensitive enough, well, Portnoy's complaint would never have seen the light of day.
Does anyone on the panel want to take issue with that? With the idea that the measure of representation should be not who has created the work, but whether they have rendered it plausibly. Yeah, do you disagree?
I don't necessarily disagree. I think we need to disambiguate two important issues. Two important issues.
Disambiguate.
Sorry. I want to point out two different issues that are often linked in discussions around issues of representation. One is the question that you pointed out, Ian, about whether or not something is plausible, something is believable. And the other question is the question of whether or not people in privileged positions have historically been the people who have been put in positions to tell those types of stories in a literary institutional environment in America that is still predominantly white, right? To talk about the examples of race, that we have to understand that the people who are evaluating works of art and literature and the people who are bringing those works to the general public also have their distinct biases, right? And so there has been a really long history of people in the majority representing people in the minority, and one of the bigger movements currently has been to try to address that history, right? And then there's this other, just sort of more amorphous issue of plausibility and the question of, how people are able to engage writers are able to engage their imaginations to be able to write minority characters. And we do live in a really deeply, just as an example, racially divided society, right? And so one of the questions is, whether or not a writer who for instance doesn't have a lot of exposure to people of other races can, represent those races as characters in their books. We were talking in the pre-panel discussion about sensitivity reading, for instance, this practice of publishers asking minorities to read books, to find red flags. And my reaction to that practice is I have friends of a lot of different cultural backgrounds, who are willing to read things that I write in order to flag sensitive issues. And I wonder whether the ways in which these practices come about, in part because there are so few of us from different backgrounds talking to each other in each other's intimate lives on a regular basis.
So, you brought up the question of sensitivity readers, which,
I'm sorry, before you change the subject, can I add something?
sure.
I really like what Meredith is saying, because I think this question I think the way that this issue of like, should, say, a man get to have a female protagonist, I think the way that debate is often played out, at least in the popular press, is, well, it's a writer's or a novelist's job to imagine another person, and so why shouldn't you be able to do that, since that's sort of basically what the job is. And I feel like that's such a facile way of looking at it, because it doesn't put any onus on the author to basically have to do all of this research of like what that character would be like. And I think, I mean, like, it sounds a little bit callous, but I think that when it's done well, people don't complain. I'm sorry to go back to the example of Green Book, but stay with me. I will move on to other movies also. But the reason why people really were angry about Green Book is that it is part of a system where a lot of white people get to represent Black people in a very specific pigeonholed role, and therefore you have the perpetuation of a particular type of power dynamic. I think I'm moving on to different movies now. There was a no, this is relevant though. If you have a movie like The Favorite, which was also nominated for an Oscar this past year, the director is a man, and it is about 3 lesbians in a royal setting. People did not complain that the director was a man, because that movie was very well done and doesn't really play into the same old tropes of how men depict lesbianism. And so again, I think if you do it well, people are much less likely to protest it on those grounds.
So, Ayan, I want to bring you into this conversation as somebody who has written many different characters, some where you have a cultural commonality, some where you do not. Do you believe this kind of screen, that there's sort of a higher threshold, as perhaps Ingu is suggesting, to kind of get it right if you're writing across culture or gender or another divide? Or do you believe, that that's false, and that is kind of constricting of the imagination, and that putting that kind of extra onus, is a form of impairment of creative freedom?
I don't know. I feel like, just to sort of go back to the beginning of this conversation, if I try to understand what Wesley's saying, which resonates for me, the sort of dichotomy he articulated in October and which he was articulating tonight, I feel that increasingly the politics, that audiences, there seems to be a kind of growth of audiences responding to the politics of representation the way that they would have to aesthetic criteria before. And that's a shift that strikes me as very confusing. because I'm not sure at what point we are in the realm of propaganda proper, right? In the sense that I can be very moved by something that I am touched by because it resonates with my values, but it may not have any aesthetic value at all, right? But I may still be incredibly moved, and I may feel that it has moved the needle in the culture in some significant way that feels like the proper moral true north that as I see it. This is Green Book. I mean,
It's what you're intending to go on.
no, it's okay. I have
nothing more to say.
Okay. So I think as somebody who, again, another contradiction came of age in the post-structuralist atmosphere, recognizing or being taught that the aesthetics, the production sort of narrative craft and accepted, received technique was the locus of hegemonic phallocentric power, right? I was taught that, and I certainly understand that perspective. I, on the other hand, have chosen over time, I've been doing this now for 30 some years, to try to hone my craft, and increasingly have found that some of those accepted ways of producing stories in narrative form have deep resonance for me across any cultural or ideological critique. To me, the benchmark, increasingly as I get older, writer who I read every day, Shakespeare, it's impossible to know what Shakespeare's politics were. Shakespeare was a reactionary and a progressive and someone who seemed to understand the experience of others and also seems to not understand the experience of others. But there's something enduring about how Shakespeare formed his stories and thought in words that is enduring. And I don't think it's worth, there's a lot of problematic stuff in Shakespeare, but it doesn't change the underlying value that I'm finding. I'd like to say one, I'm sorry, I mean, I get another chance to speak with the illustrious panel here. What I would like to say about sensitivity readers, something that I said to you, Suzanne,
Yes.
and you sort of looked at me like, okay, you should say that thing. Which is just that, I was having a conversation with one of the publishers recently about a book that has created some acquisition that has created some trouble, and somebody had said, well, if we'd only run it by a sensitivity reader, we would have known some of the issues. And to which my response was, if you folks had run my work by the sensitivity readers of the community that I come from, I wouldn't have a career. I've been writing in critique of my American Muslim, Pakistani Muslim community for 10 years. And I have people who come to my events. In Chicago, there was a group of housewives that came to my event. 8 of them sat in the front row, arms crossed, staring at me the whole time. Yeah. And one of them raised their hand at the end of the event and got up and said, we came from the suburbs to hear you talk just to figure out how to make sure our children don't turn out like you. If you give the book to one of them as a sensitivity reader, they're gonna marshal the forces of the suburbs to have the book canceled, right? And that's an example where, look, I'm not making a case. I don't know about anything else. I just know that if there had been sensitivity readers in my case, I wouldn't have a career.
Can you just turn on your mic?
I'm not sure what you're agreeing with,
But everything is, so first of all, I'm so glad you brought up Shakespeare, because if you look back on the history of literature, so much of it is about the ability to imagine people who are not you, who are different from you, who are different gender, race, time, who lived in a time, and in a way, that power of the imagination is about being a human being, and that's part of what we're doing. I also think about sensitivity reading. One of the things that bothers me is somehow it seems to have crept into the culture that the point of writing, or the point of writing fiction, is to make people feel safe and comfortable and secure. And I'm kind of astonished by that, because I never thought that was the point. I never thought that was my job or anybody else's job. And
you thought the point was actually the opposite.
What we're supposed to do, one of the things that we can do is make people question the world we're living in, or question themselves, even more importantly, or question the dominant culture, or question all of it. And the idea that literature is meant, or writing is meant to affirm what you thought before you started reading it seems to me a really dangerous way of looking at writing.
It also, can I say something more? It also, sensitivity and so on, it tends to reduce cultures, communities, races, and so on to an extraordinary degree, because it leaves out the question of class, for example. If you'd have, let's say, a Japanese American who grew up in Santa Monica and went to Berkeley, vetting a book about, let's say, Japanese outcasts or something like that, to see whether it's sensitive towards Japanese, it would be absurd, because that person would have just as little to do with the subject of that book as a suburban white person. So I think to reduce things to white man or Asian American is well, it's anti-literary, and human beings are much too complicated for that.
I'll push back maybe a little bit and just ask this question. I mean, Aeon, you say that, and that you wouldn't have a career had your work been put through a sensitivity reader, but I can imagine someone saying,
I may not
well,
have a career in the future after this panel.
see about that remains to be seen. But someone might say, look, you have this background yourself. So this is not the same as Ian, or Francine or anyone else on this panel trying to write those stories. And if they try to write those stories, that's sort of a different act.
But that's actually not the environment we're in right now, Suzanne, because when Disgrace, the play that I wrote, which was done around the country and ended up getting a lot of attention, and it's a play about an anti-hero. It's parenthetically, I often sort of say that if you're a writer of color, you can't write anti-heroes because they're considered stereotypes. If you're a writer of the dominant sort of culture, you can write an anti-hero, and there's complexity, psychological complexity. I wrote an anti-hero, and because the anti-hero acts out in a manner, in a violent manner that has political valences, it was perceived as some hewing to some stereotype, right? So there was a very, very strong movement amongst the regional theater community to have the play not be done at many of the theaters. Most of them ended up going ahead to do it, but every theater that committed to do the play would get a package, a 40-page how-to, if you were going to do this play and subject your community to the injustice that this play will visit upon its Muslim members, this is what you need to do. And therefore, there were talkbacks at every show. That was part of every theater refused to do the play unless there were talkbacks after the show. I was fine with it. If people want to stay and talk about the play, that's great. I just feel, again, we're in an environment where the politics of representation are what people are responding to primarily over the aesthetics. And so to the extent that they need to sort through the politics of the representation after they've had an experience, to me, I guess I failed as an artist, because if they've got to work it out communally, then I don't know what I've left them with really fundamentally. So, I mean, I don't think it's just an issue that is about, I can write about Muslims, he can't write about Muslims, or he can't write about this. Or, I think it's more complicated than that, because it doesn't track along those lines.
I mean, is this a phase? Like, I'm curious, Wesley, maybe going back to you.
Before we change, can I just respond?
Sure.
I think from the perspective of a critic and consumer, and therefore not a creator, I feel like it's, at least in part, a false dichotomy to position aesthetics versus politics. You can argue that both of them have to do with a form of pleasure, right? Aesthetics, obviously, I think like the pleasure of the reader is obvious enough. I think for a lot of readers, what they want is sort of validation of their self, or a validation that like their worldview is correct. You can sort of like argue against this, or like argue that like it's not a good way to read something. But I don't think that those things should be completely divorced. I think also that the thing that Aya was talking about is when it comes to issues, to the desire for representation, I think we should make a distinction between the desire for positive representation, because let's say, I can speak from experience. So like when I was growing up, Margaret Cho was like the only Korean American person that anybody knew. And because she was not a respectable comedian, because she talked about, sex and being friendly with gay people, et cetera, people really disliked her within the Korean American community because she was clearly a pioneer. But that was because she was the only person who had any sort of spotlight in that area. And so the desire for positive representation, I think, is like obvious. But I think that, at least in my reading of it, the way that a lot of people want representation now is not role models, but something authentic that feels true to the way that people have lived. And so I don't know if that's tracked at all with your experience, but I think it is important to make that distinction at least.
No, I totally get it. I didn't want to pose an absolute dichotomy. I'm finding myself perplexed as a producer of narrative stories. This environment that we're in, where folks are relating increasingly, it seems to me, to the politics of the representation as they used to toward aesthetics. That's it. I'm not just saying that's my anecdotal observation. I may have some sort of epistemological problem that I don't really understand what I'm seeing, but that's what I find myself seeing. And so as a writer trying to figure out how to write in that environment and how to write compellingly in ways that speak to the deeper yearnings of the audience, this is an ongoing question for me. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm perplexed by it. That's all.
I want to build on, what you raised and sort of ask whether people think this is sort of a phase. Is this part of the quest for a more equal and inclusive America, let's say, or even global culture, where we have communities that have been excluded for so long? There's a kind of pressing demand for inclusion, for people to have a voice, be able to tell stories, create films, television, write books, and that if we can kind of press through this phase, we may get to a different moment where this relationship between representation and aesthetics, reaches a kind of new normal. I don't know if it reverts back to something more like what you feel you're accustomed to, or whether you think the shift in power dynamics means, that the new normal will never revert to that world, and that kind of representation is permanently kind of taking on a new level of force. I'm curious, I guess, Wesley, having thought about this, or Meredith, who maybe is looking a little more ready, but either of you would love to hear what you think.
Right. I mean, I don't think it's a phase. I mean, I do think that, I do think that that trend of people, being really concerned about representation, especially in the internet culture, has been one that has existed for a really long time. I guess, I also don't necessarily think of it as, I don't necessarily think of it as the sort of dichotomous relationship between aesthetics and representation. I just think that, that we live in a time where we should challenge ourselves to be able to represent other people in ways that have some relationship to, the experiences of those people as they live them in life. And there are really, really important challenges, and there are really, really big difficulties that are involved, for as many cases that I find where, people are picking on, what I personally feel are not particularly important aspects of the story, I do find that, especially in trans representations, right, by cisgender people, there are just so many tropes that involve, trans people being objectified, trans people being used as symbols rather than actual people. We're always the secret villain, we're always the big reveal who, were always the victim, right? And being able to find ways to simultaneously have a really effective story while at the same time not, perpetuating really terrible myths about entire demographics of people. I feel like those two goals shouldn't be mutually exclusive.
I disagree. I think the problem, though, is that people in minorities, especially if they're marginalized, often have myths about themselves, or, to put it in another way, the way people actually live their lives and the way they would like outsiders, especially outsiders in the majority, to see them are not quite the same thing. And there's a very good example of this. There was a play about Sikhs written in Britain a few decades ago. And it was about a rape case by a Sikh who raped a woman. And the Sikh community protested and threatened violence, and the play had to be taken off. Now, the playwright was himself a Sikh. And it was not the way that the representatives of the so-called Sikh community wanted Sikhs to be seen to the outside world. Not in front of the Goyim, a fine Jewish. So, and the not in front of the Goyim principle applies to many minorities. So the way people want to be represented is not necessarily the way they actually live. And therefore, I feel I'm very skeptical about this idea of sensitivity reading and so on and so forth.
Well, we all remember the reception that Portnoy's complaint got when it came out.
Yeah, when the rabbi introduced him at the seminary, he said, in the Middle Ages, we would have known what to do with a Jew like this.
Exactly, and that word, for better, it's endured, and it was about something, and it was, I don't know if this is, one of the things that I think that we keep needing to talk about, and that doesn't come into these conversations, is the quality of the writing itself. The quality of the writing itself. One of the reasons I think people are still reading Portnoy's complaint, regardless of whether Jews at the time thought it was a good idea or not, was that it was so beautifully written. And does that matter anymore? Is it all about politics? And that question about aesthetics versus the politics of representation is a very important question, I think, because finally, what matters is how the language is used, whether we think it's true, whether we think it's beautiful. All of those things are subjective too. We've begun to talk as if there's certain objective realities about these things, and they're not. Any response to art is a subjective response.
I would just say that part of the reason we're in this situation at the moment is because, your question to me, your most recent question to me was a question of whether the shift that I've observed in the way we talk about our art and culture and institutions is a trend. But part of the reason for the shift is because the people trying to circle a wagon around this stuff have been treated like a trend. Do you know what I mean? It's a completely legitimate thing to do, this question of this sort of valorization of the representation. It's legitimate at least in this country because, this is not a mind-blowing secret for since the inception of American popular culture, the only people who had any sort of say in how anybody did anything were white people. And it is a completely legitimate thing in this particular moment to observe something shifting in the culture where you see, I think percentage-wise we're talking about 14% or something, but 14% is a seismic shift compared to 100 years before that, when it was 1%, 0%. And I do think if you are, I didn't want the thing I wrote to be about generational shift, but the generations do matter. And if you're a young person or a person who grew up in the years of 2008 to 2000, oh my God, I didn't want it to end. I can't remember when you got out of office, 2016. If you had this man as your president, as a person coming into yourself as an American and as a human being, and you kind of a little bit knew how hard it, like the alleged impossibility of having a black president because your parents or your teachers or somebody told you it just was inconceivable. But it was normal to you because it happened and you didn't know anything about your struggles. The idea that you could go from that to this, the idea that you are aware that the culture has splintered and niched and sort of split apart so much, there's no sort of, I mean, whatever we once meant by a monoculture was basically when it came to certain things that like a handful of corporations controlled everything. And it's not changed. But I think there are more ways to get culture that sort of speaks to the person that you think you are. And the idea that that can all be taken away, I mean, I think that part of what I'm observing and feeling in both camps of this sort of nervousness about how to receive this change is that it can all disappear at any minute. And it's really fragile. And I think that if like the TV, I mean, I've said this before, bear with me if anybody's heard me say this before, but I think it's worth thinking about as a philosophical exercise. If the great TV apocalypse happened tomorrow and all this peak TV, too much TV went away and we were back to so-called monoculture and there were 4 networks, I really think we should really take a really serious look about who would be on that TV. The reason you see all these trans people and black people and Asians on TV right now, poorer people, not that many poor people on TV, is that there's a wealth of places to put these people because there's money. And I don't know, I feel like part of the thing that makes me unhappy as a person who likes to talk about culture, which is that I'm in a disposition, I'm at a disadvantage talking about the actual quality of the work, is that I also understand the value in just shutting up and just being happy to have lots of different things that don't look like what things looked like 30 years ago. So we're fucked in some ways. And I think that one way past this might be time, but it also is going to take people actually kind of doing a thing that I don't really enjoy, but it's going to take a kind of activism to make the people who make our stuff aware that the stuff that all kinds of different people want to see matters. Whether it's good or not, I hope it's good. It doesn't have to be good. But I think that part of the thing I observed also is that like just to sort of stay with the piece that I wrote, like I mean the idea that Issa Rae's show Insecure was on HBO can be a milestone for being basically a sitcom about young black women in Los Angeles and also be bad. That to me is the milestone. And to be able to say that the show is bad or mediocre, it's not totally bad. I just don't like it. And I feel it should be okay to say that. And I shouldn't have to go to culture prison. I know. I'm just, this is all anecdotal. These are fights I've actually had, not just that one time in the story. But I think that I also understand why we're having, I just wanted to mark a change in the way that we talk about this stuff because the change is important.
Could I ask what my fellow panelists felt about The Wire?
What aspect?
No, just your responses to it. I mean, because that was an example of something that was created by people who were not the people they were writing about. Right? I mean, they came from Baltimore, they all had that in common. But they were basically white people writing about black people. So I'm just, right? Did I get this wrong?
Yeah.
So,
Anyone want it?
yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, because if we're saying, there's a tendency more and more to say, it's probably a better idea to represent your own community or your own blah, blah, blah. And this wasn't that. So I'm just curious. I mean, I really am, I'm just.
I don't know if anyone wants to comment about the fire.
I like the fire.
Yeah,
But I would like to say something, which is that I didn't become an artist to be, and I don't mean this in any dismissive way, I don't mean it may come off that way, I can have that kind of affect sometimes, but I didn't become an artist to be in PR. I didn't become an artist to be in advertising. That's not what I want to do. That's not why I'm doing it. There's something beyond that for me, and I feel increasingly that I'm subject to, within my own sort of community, the work that I do, the way that it's interpreted or misinterpreted. Frankly, I often joke, and it's kind of even a joke. I'm only successful to the extent that I've been misinterpreted, really. And I think that that's okay. But if being understood was that important to me, and making sure that I got the representations right, and making sure that my community really felt emboldened and they felt good about the work that I was doing, I would be making a lot more money doing something else. I mean, I think and so that to me is where the rubber meets the road for me. I don't want to do this that way. I just don't want, I'm not interested in it.
But presumably you're not writing for your community. You're writing
But of
for
course
anybody who wants to see your play.
To heap yet another unbearable pretension on everything else that I've said tonight, in the smithy of my soul to forge the conscience of my race. Of course I'm writing for my people. Yeah, but that's not to make them look good. You know, I don't think that we as human beings are, as T.S. Eliot would believe. I'm going down that pretentious, don't just keep going.
You're in a safe space. It's okay.
T.S. Eliot, humanity can only bear, so much truth. So I think that that's something that we as artists, I believe that an artist, that's the job. The job is to present the community or the human race with the conundrums of ourselves. That's not going to make people feel better. That's not even the job. That's not even what this is supposed to be. That's, at least for me, it's not.
But do you feel like The Wire is doing also those things?
Do I feel like The Wire's doing those things?
No, that was a joke. Sorry.
I like The Wire.
What's really fascinating to me about your position is that I, as a trans writer who writes a lot of things that other trans people disagree with, right, and is very nervously publishing a memoir next year that contains a lot of opinions that trans people disagree with. I completely empathize with just the desire to be able to speak freely without necessarily feeling people behind you potentially pushing back against your work. But I also, at the same time, I think I've absorbed that as somebody who has been writing for the internet for the past 5 years as a necessary challenge, right? Because of the fact that there have been so many terrible, absolutely terrible representations of trans people that it is really important to actually clarity. And it is actually really important for me to think about, the tropes that my work is falling under, and understanding that most of the people who will be reading my work, even if it's for a trans audience, are cisgender, if it's being published, by a mainstream publisher. And so I guess as a writer, I've been able to sort of, to be able to understand that I am writing for myself. I'm writing to represent my community according to my interests. But at the same time, I can't just ignore the fact that, that there are other people who have varying opinions about how trans people should be represented.
Is there any contradiction? I mean, isn't it perfect except that that's how you see your role, and you're a different generation and you're part of a different community, and you see your role differently. You want to do different things as an artist, and both can coexist.
If you found a story that you felt was irresistible about a trans person, and the person in the story, the trans person, was a monster of some sort, how would you feel about writing that story?
I mean, I've been absolutely interested in writing. I mean, because I do feel like similar to what Wesley was talking about, one mark a community's sort of maturity in terms of representation is to be able to represent us in all of the ways that we are, right? Whether or not we, we are paragons of virtue, or we're monsters in various ways, right? But the fact is that, we as a community have been represented as monsters in precisely, in very, very, in super stereotyped ways historically, right? And so no, I wouldn't hesitate to, and in fact, there are drafts sitting in my, the MFA novel that I wrote 10 years ago, which I need to revise, did deal with these tropes of terrorism and monstrosity. I do think that those are really, really valid concerns.
I think we live in really apocalyptic times, and I think one of the things that people seem to be afraid of is that this cancel culture, or whatever you want to call it, is going to continue to escalate. And if you put a label on one thing, calling it like Xist, then it is just going to be condemned to the dust heap of history or something. Sorry, I can also be literary. But I think that I'm going to be foolish and I'm going to make a prediction of the future. And I think that what is probably going to happen is people are going to realize you can put any sort of XYZ label on anything, and the art will still probably be pretty good, or maybe you find 10% of it objectionable, but you can enjoy the other 90%. And I think that people will be able to deal with the cognitive dissonance as they have been for as long as art has existed and move on. So I do think that the current time that we live in is a space of transition, and it will probably not be so panicked soon.
Has there ever been a time that there was a transition?
I want to just say, speaking of transition, that soon we will make a transition, and we will invite our audience to join into the conversation. I'm going to ask one last question, but please think about what you might like to ask, and then they're going to be a couple of Penn staff are going to come around with microphones, so I'll ask up to answer me. I guess, I want to turn to this because we've kind of touched on these generational questions and this cancellation. And Wesley wrote in his piece, what's bad for some people is deemed bad for everybody. If some compliance is in order, lest you wind up problematic too. So when you were editing the New York Review of Books, you published a piece by Gian Gomeshi entitled Reflections on a Hashtag that struck many people as an undeservedly prominent placement for a self-serving piece by a journalist accused on multiple counts of harassing women. And so that piece was deemed problematic, and as Wesley would put it, you wound up problematic too. So much so that within days you were out of a job. And I really, would like to hear from your perspective whether, was that to you sort of an artifact of this moment that we've been talking about? Was it a question of timing? Was it something more fundamental that you perhaps missed about the nature of this piece and the audiences that was going to reach? Was it a generational thing? I'm curious kind of how you make sense of that.
We can argue about the merits of the piece, but I don't think that is the real point here. I think the New York times have changed in the sense that the New York Review once published Norman Mailer, who stabbed his wife, published Jack Abbott, who was in prison and was promoted by Norman Mailer and wrote for the New York Review. He was a criminal. He came out of prison partly out of pressure, because of pressure from Mailer and the New York Review, and stabbed a man to death. And there was a lot of controversy. Some people thought this was a typical example of naive liberal tolerance. Other people saw it as a form of sort of literary machismo of people like Mailer and the New York Review. But nobody got fired. It was fought out in the letters columns, people debated about it and so on, which is the way it should be. I think what has changed is that partly because of the social media and so on, that if you publish something as an editor that makes people feel uncomfortable, that people disagree with, that people think maybe if it's badly edited, maybe feel should not have been in the magazine at all, that the pressure is so great that you immediately have to be kicked out of your job. Not only that, but then I'm told by other liberal magazines, for whom I've been a contributor for many years, that we really can't have you write for us anymore because the younger editors, you must understand, the times we're living in. Now that is very disturbing, whatever you think of the piece, because the result of that is that people are going to become super cautious, they're going to become very frightened of being hounded out of their jobs, denounced in the social media and so on. And this is not going to add to an open and free, spirited intellectual culture.
Can I ask?
So, while did you have any idea that people were going to respond to the piece in the way that they did? I mean, what were the conversations like at the New York Review of Books?
Because I knew that it was going to be very controversial. I knew that there would be a lot of criticism, and I saw it as my role as an editor, especially in something that is being widely discussed, quite rightly. I'm not disagreeing with the aims of Me Too. I think it's entirely legitimate that everything should be done to create equal opportunities for women. Women should be treated absolutely the same as men. You can't have people chasing each other around the desk in the workplace. I totally agree with all that. But especially since it is something that is exercising so many people, I wanted as many points of view as possible, including that of a man who had been accused himself. Right? And I thought it was interesting, controversial, sure. I knew that there would be a lot of blowback. What I didn't know was how serious the consequences would be for me. But I'd assumed this is an independent magazine, which represents independence of thought and free-spiritedness and so on, and it could take a bit of control. That was my assumption. My assumption was wrong. Does that answer your question?
Well, sort of. I mean, I guess I read every issue of that publication, and it just seemed as a piece to be beneath the quality of the other things of most of what else gets published.
You may be totally right, but editors should not be fired.
Oh no! But I'm sort of laying the groundwork for which this sort of meta conversation took place that resulted in what happened, right? Because it seemed like the piece itself is divorced from, it lived online first. And it was attached to two other pieces that were about, I mean, if I remember, it was the fall of men, or the decline of men, right? There was a review of a Jim Brown biography, and I can't remember what the third piece was. But I don't know. I mean, I guess the question I would ask you is, you knew it would be, I mean, I'm just trying to get a sense of what your, it seemed to be like a cavalier, not you yourself, but the publication of the piece. There seemed to be something kind of nose thumbing at the moment, as opposed to a real interrogation of what it's about. Because I think the thing that I am still dying to read is a man actually wrestle with his actual behavior, as opposed to deflect the reception of the way his behavior was received. And I felt, I mean, you can tell me
that would be a different piece.
Yeah, that would be the, I guess I think the problem with that piece, and I think the reason that it created the firestorm that it created, was that I think people are hungry I think we were malnourished. And I think that there's a hunger to have this other reckoning, which isn't just men going to prison or to trial or losing their jobs. I mean, it's an actual real thing that your publication is so well positioned to be able to do, which is have these men kind of account for themselves. And I don't think that anybody should have been fired for it at all. But I do think, I don't know, it felt like a missed opportunity, but
Yeah, but that's
not
it's
the
a
same
different
thing.
subject.
Right.
It's a totally legitimate subject. You could indeed publish an article by a man who wrestles with his conscience and what did I do, why did I do it, and why is it wrong, and so on. Entirely legitimate. Not terribly original, because I don't think that the reception of that piece would have been controversial in any sense. But the reason I thought this piece was interesting is because it raised a question about crime and punishment. If you're living in a society where the rule of law governs society, the question of crime and punishment is fairly straightforward. You commit a crime, you're tried for it. If you're guilty, you are sentenced. There is a punishment. It has a time limit. You go to prison, or you pay a fine, or whatever else it is. What happens in the case of somebody who, rightly or wrongly, but taken to court, gets off? So that as far as the law is concerned, he was declared innocent. And there were many other accusations. He may have been guilty of things he was accused of. That happens after court cases. That's not unusual. Now, then there's another form of punishment, which is relatively new and driven largely by social media, is that people then become denounced and become non-people in a little bit in the way that they used to be in the Soviet Union when you got eliminated from a photograph. You were no longer supposed to exist. You have to get lost. And that was something I thought was worth thinking about. And therefore, the question that interested me in his story was not the entirely legitimate question of what he was accused of, the exact nature. We probably should have forced him to say more about that. I acknowledge that. But the question that interested me is what happens to a person afterwards, even if he's considered, if he gets off in a trial. And so the nature of how somebody like that should be punished, I think, is a legitimate subject.
Absolutely. The irony is you're learning the answer to some of your questions from your own experience. You know, what you said about what's happened with you, not just at the review, but at other places. I do want to open up the floor to questions. So I'm just going to say, raise your hand prominently, and Grace and Mannion, line up here. Okay, so line up. I'll have two lines on the left and the right. And we'll try to alternate unless everybody goes to the right. But let's, Alberta. Do you want to just say your name?
Catherine Dalsimer. This isn't a question. I'd like to tell an experience I had a few years ago.
We're really going to limit it to questions, actually, Catherine. I want to let you say something, but okay. I'm just in the interest of having so many people up here. I want to limit it to questions. But thank you. If we have time, we'll come back. Please go ahead.
Hi, and thank you all for your perspectives. I guess I was wondering, as a writer, trying to find my voice and listening to all of this, it occurs to me that I'm a Jewish, middle-aged mother of two, I'm a wife, I'm this and that. But just finding out who you are and sort of the universal things that might be universal to others that might be interested in reading what you write. Some of what you're talking about in terms of identity and all the fear that's going around about what gets said and who has an opinion about it, it's very, it's difficult. And so I'm wondering how you grapple with that as writers, knowing that, you know, if you're Jewish and Jews don't agree, or if you're Jewish and you talk about Christians, but then of course Christians won't agree. You know, how much of that comes into play when writers already have a hard time finding their voice? How is this affecting people who really want to put their opinions out there in a real way? I mean,
right.
That's the question.
I think it makes sense. It's sort of the self-censoring dimension of these debates.
Well, I mean, I should say that for me, one of the great pleasures of being a fiction writer is that I'm not me when I'm writing. I'm other people. I'm inhabiting other people who are nothing like me. And so I've never been concerned with this question of what my particular voice was, because I always felt more like a ventriloquist than than someone who's involved in self-expression of any sort. So I think, essayists have quite a different experience, journalists have a different experience, but if we're talking about writing fiction, it's something else, and your own personal history matters less, I think.
And also, nobody, human beings are complicated. And no writer worth his or her salt can be reduced to just one community or one thing. I speak to somebody, I'm afraid to say I can't speak as an ASA because I wouldn't know which ASA to pick. There are so many to choose from. I think every writer is complex in that way. And there is your sexuality, there's your ethnic background, there's your religious background, your cultural background, your class, and so on. This is all a great big mixed up soup. And I think if you start to reduce it to one identity, I doubt whether very interesting work will emerge.
My name is Alan Kurzweil. I have thousands of questions. I'll try and combine two into one. The first is very direct and simple. This panel is bookended by two novelists or two creatives and a lot of essayists, journalists, commentators on the act of producing a story. And I'm curious whether all of you or some of you can find, rather than an effort to right wrongs, to come up with some writing rights. Are there some universal opportunities that storytellers have? I situate that sort of specifically and more explicitly in asking the question that Francine posed, which is, what do you think about The Wire, or Shakespeare for that matter? Meaning, I didn't hear answers except from the two storytellers who endorsed the act of telling a story that is not the writer's own. But do the people who are not necessarily primarily or even at all storytellers, do they endorse that position?
That you can tell a story that is not your own.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's do maybe just a quick round robin on that question, just a sentence or two each.
I do think that in principle you should be able to tell a story that is not your own, but I also think that part of the reason why we receive Shakespeare the way that we receive Shakespeare is that he was writing within the political context of his time. I can admire The Merchant of Venice while at the same time say that in the particular context that we're in, it traded in tropes about Jewish people that I find objectionable. I think that both of those statements can be true.
Yes. I mean, it's boring if you don't take the risk. I mean, what's the point? I don't know. I think you do your thing and then we'll figure it out. But I feel like just having having an imagination and having empathy, that's all you need. And
have you seen The Wire?
Oh, you want me to answer the Wire question? Yes, The Wire is great. The Wire is great. The Wire is great. The Wire's got problems, and the more you stay in the world and you know other people, you understand what the problems of The Wire actually are. But it's a great work of art that is actually trying to take on something that American art never takes on, which is the system of oppression, poverty, all of the ancillary things that create the conditions that lead to a Baltimore neighborhood to be the way that it is. It is a great work of art. And within
Can I just say one more thing about it? One of the great, please, just one thing. One of the things that's great about it is this does the thing which art can make you do, which it makes you reverse your easy moral positions about things. You watch the first season and here's this kid who's murdered, whatever, two people before it begins. And by the end, when he goes to jail, you're beside yourself with grief, even though you know he's murdered. That's an easy moral position you've taken, and it's over with. And great art can do that, which is one of the reasons that I'm a fan.
Frankie.
My question is, why do writers and artists take so much pleasure in writing about Black people's pain. I'm surprised that, like, just even with the movies that have come out, it's like there's a pleasure in writing about the pain. They say sex sells. I think Black people's pain sells. And I think there should be a moratorium. I'm just curious, what do you think about, you wouldn't write about the transgender community or any other community, but Black people's pain sells. And I'm just wondering why artists and writers take so much pleasure in writing about our damn pain. That's my question.
You mean white writers or everybody? Because I will tell you, I'm on some funky mailing lists where like I get, if a Black person farts on a page in my mailbox, and a lot of it's not all good, and a lot of it's very similar, and a lot of it is about it's some version of the question that you just asked. But it is just like I have pain for 300 words or 300 pages. It is not an exploration of that trauma. That's a separate question from I think the question you were actually asking, right? Which is like there is I think there's an ancillary, there's a formula that needs your question plus a white protagonist. That is I mean in terms of the way the thing that actually sells is not the pain, it is some guard or shepherd or solver or steward of that pain, right? Like in a weird way, just to bring up everybody's favorite movie, Green Book is a really amazing example of this because I mean I could also bring up I reread Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Oh my God, the trauma. I think that there's a long history, obviously, of the representation of this question that you're asking. But I think there are a lot of ways to talk about Black life in this country. It doesn't all have to be about kind of post-traumatic stress. I mean, very honest depictions sort of incorporate that or understand it, but it's not the only thing going on with Black people. But I do think that it is a sort of, I would say that there are versions of there are works of art that try to do this for all kinds of people that I would just say are botched empathies. You know, they're attempts at empathy that don't work. And they may come from a real place of curiosity or compassion, but they're just like, as far as I'm concerned, they don't work, but they're an attempt to understand what the pain is or what it's about or who caused it or something.
Please. One phenomenon I noticed in such a highly globalized world is that people are often identifying with certain cultures or identities that ideologies even that are not what they outwardly represent. And so, for example, I have a friend who grew up, she's Asian American, but she feels very distinctly American and white in her ideology. So how does that sort of identity play into these questions?
Chosen rather than a born identity. Yes.
I mean, we haven't really talked about wokeness, you know, which can be interpreted as that, right? You know, white people who take on minority-related issues. No. I mean, I guess that internet culture does, does encourage forms of empathy and forms of embodying other people's experiences that perhaps, perhaps allows for us, for people who are more steeped in that culture to find themselves interacting with and identifying with, with people who are not like them. And I've certainly noticed that. And one thing that I have noticed, a phenomenon and what's really interesting is that I have both, sort of like tried to hold other people accountable, but I have also been, people have also tried to cancel me for things that I've written. And one of the things that I've noticed is that often especially, like if I write about minority issues, there are a lot of seemingly white people who are the first in line to raise objections. It seems like a phenomenon. I don't know, Inku, if you have thoughts about that as somebody who writes for the internet. The idea that there are people who tend to embody ideologies that do not correspond with their actual identities.
Are we talking about like Rachel Dolezal?
And that's not an ideology. Sorry. Yeah. That's not ideology. That's an identity, right? Like, the question I heard that I thought you were asking was one about just, it sounded more like a question of imagination to me. Like in being able to imagine characters who don't think what you think. I don't know. Again, I'm all for that. It's the only way art works is if you are able to lay out things that don't in any way correspond to what you think, but they represent a work, they can create a world or add up to it.
All right, so we have about just 10 minutes left, so I think I'll keep the questioners that we have, but I'll try to get back to Catherine before we wrap up, please.
So I wanted to go back to something that happened in a panel earlier that I wanted a lot of clarification from any of you, but particularly some of the issues you raised in terms of your work and how your work has been received. And I wonder if there's a distinction that we want that this conversation can take in terms of thinking about the politics of representation versus respectability politics. Because it sounds like your particular critique about how your work has been received by your community is much more akin to respectability politics. And I would love for the panel to talk a little bit more about that.
Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by respectability politics?
I mean in the sense that because the dominant culture represents.
So lucky not to know.
Yeah, super fortunate.
I think even if I didn't, I might want to know what you're.
Well, here's what I'm hearing is that in your concern about, like, you said something about people of color can't be anti-heroes in art. And I think mass culture actually is trying to disabuse you of that notion.
Sure.
I think people of color are definitely trying to drum up the anti-hero kind of narrative to actually show the full spectrum of humanity, which I think high art will actually start to do more of once we have
That's not only happening in the Muslim community because of the politics of the style.
Right. But this is what I mean by respectability politic, is that because the misrepresentation of the marginalized group has been so dominant in the dominant culture, it means that all representation in the dominant culture that reaches white audiences has to conform to that. Yeah.
I think the question was to the panel, wasn't it?
Well, no, it was to you.
Oh, that was so the question is.
Do you think that your work has to I think what I'm hearing from you, and I wondered if you could confirm or affirm or think about that,
right.
Is the politics of representation that seems to silence your work, could it actually be more about trying to present a more respectable image?
I think that, thank you for all of the laborious clarification on my part. I think that I'm not sure I really fundamentally, philosophically see the difference, right? Because I think that what we're talking about is the politics of representation. And then it turns out that within the Muslim community, the politics of representation are very binary, or they're actually unipolar. And that therefore, there is a concern amongst my family members and others in my community that those representations need to be broadened, and that if I'm going to have the platform that apparently they think I have, that I should use that platform to broaden those horizons, right?
Ding, 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 that's respectability politics.
Gotcha. So yes, I'm very well versed in the human reality of this. Well, what I find challenging is that I don't find myself I'm not writing the stereotypes. The stereotypes are in the mind of the audience. That's not my problem.
That's respectability politics.
Yeah, all right, good. So I guess I am concerned about respectability politics, but I see my own situation. I see it mapped against some of the conversations that are happening in a much larger sense within the culture. And so I see my microcosm, the dilemmas of my microcosm, as reflected in the macrocosm.
All right, it's like there's no such thing as a simple question in this or a short answer in a conversation like this, but we'll try to get through everybody we have, please.
Okay. I hear from a lot of marginalized writers, and I've experienced it myself as an autistic writer, being told you write for niche. And so I appreciated what you said, Wesley Morris, about the concern about corporations turning us into a monoculture. And I want to ask you all, how can we fight? How can our activism be directed against a monoculture? And is that something every single one of you can agree on?
So, fighting the monoculture. How and does everybody agree we should be fighting the monoculture? If so, raise your hand.
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, I used it somewhat facetiously, but I mean, I guess you could politicize the idea of monoculture as you just did, which is I had never meant for it to be politicized, but you're actually right. That, I mean, it is a flattening. It's not a democratization. It's actually it's a flattening. And I'm against anything that flattens or stifles or censors or anything like that. But I also do like the sort of conventional idea of a monoculture, which is there's a thing that we can all go to work on. We can all go to work on Tuesday and be like, I watched this thing last night. Did you watch it? And everybody in the office is watching. That is the definition number one monoculture. Right? But again, once you like unpack that, like what aren't you seeing and talking about when you go to work on Tuesday? So I mean, there's a corollary downside that you've identified.
We have it's not
Sorry.
totally uniformly an answer to that question. Lena.
Hi. I'm sorry, I wanted to remember this quote by Solomon that is really good, but I can't remember it. But basically, I'm thinking right now as I listen to the most important writers I heard growing up were always talking and reacting against the sort of requirement to represent. And I think about the dissidents in Romania, the writers that were important, and the writers that really shaped, I think of Václav Havel. I think of this idea of the writer as someone who is not citizen. And I'm fascinated by the extent to which our representations and our allegiances now somehow hold us deeply in debt to a sort of commitment that we can't articulate, but also a fear that we can't totally bound because it's amorphous and it's changing. So I will say one more thing. I don't write as a Romanian, I write against my Romanian culture, but I write deeply against this country as well. I feel very strongly that I don't identify in some ways, even though I am American and complicit in everything that we do. So I'm just curious to know each of your primary allegiances, if you have to break it down, what's your primary allegiance? And it doesn't have to be to a country, it can be to another aspect of your identity.
That's a hard question.
Wants to know for the panelists their primary, whether they have a primary allegiance that they would articulate.
People. I mean, literate people. I mean, I don't know. I feel like once you, I don't know. I mean, I'd like your other people to answer the question, but I mean, I really. Are you asking us as writers and as creators?
For example, yes, I think I've heard a lot of creators who identify strongly with a certain aspect. Others are writing from that space too. And so I'm just asking generally, when you think of yourself and describe yourself, or what you don't transgress against. So for females, for women, sometimes it'll be that. It'll be more. I think it's a hard question for everyone.
I mean, I'm pretty allied to my curiosity mostly, and and things that I'm interested in the world. And I guess in terms of how that dovetails into representation, I do feel like it is kind of a straw man argument, to sort of say a lot of what we're talking about are not, it's a separate issue, this question of respectability and this question of these protests arising because of the ways in which particular minorities are represented, right? We read for this panel, we read that case with this upcoming novel that it sounds like is attempting to rewrite a transgender man's experience into the form of a cisgender woman, at least in terms of the bustle piece that we wrote. It's really very different, from some of these more subtle issues around, being able to write about the range of experiences within a community. So I think we really need to, be very specific in whatever cases we talk about in terms of these issues of cancellation or people getting fired or books getting withdrawn, et cetera, et cetera.
Catherine, do you want to make your comment? Because I realize it is an annual general meeting, so I don't think I should close this crystal and ask.
Listening to this excellent discussion tonight, I was reminded of an experience I had a couple of years ago teaching at Mount Holyoke. I was teaching as the psychology of adolescence, and I assigned my students Maya Angelou. I know I've hate Berg since, and my white students all felt like, oh, how can we possibly understand, the suffering of a Black woman? Maya Angelou says that her grandmother, and my students were taken aback, her grandmother was always trying to get her to read Langston Hughes. She says, but it was Shakespeare that I loved because he wrote, when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast. And I think that she felt that a man, white, 4 centuries earlier, got her. That's why we're doing this.
Thank you. Okay. I think last question over here. Thank you.
So we know where you stand. Thank you.
I have a question that very much relates to the aesthetics versus political. When I was an editor at Ms. Magazine in the 70s, when we kind of unlocked the voices of hundreds and even thousands of women who never could be heard, we received mountains of manuscripts that in all frankness were not publishable, but their stories were important. So what do you think of the morality of what we did, which was to enable their stories to become publishable to a degree that one would call rewriting? So in order to allow the political to become aesthetic, we became more than editors. And I'm not quite sure that in today's world that would pass the smell test. The second thing I wanted to ask, though I know that our time is very short, is what you think about trigger warnings.
All right, so 2 great questions. Anyone want to comment on the methods at work at Ms. Magazine in the 70s?
Yeah, I mean, if it's okay for me to respond, I do edit them, which is Condé Nast's LGBT publication, and I do work with a lot of first-time writers. One of the things that, in my experience, that I experience a lot is that queer and trans people of color face enormous barriers in terms of access to education. I've heard so many stories of trans people being harassed out of school, not feeling safe, not being able to go to bathrooms, being bullied out of locker rooms, et cetera, that prevent them from having educational opportunities that allow them to work on their writing in ways that people who don't have the same barriers, right? And I don't know what you did at Ms. Magazine compared to what I do at them, but part of what I do at them is definitely go an extra mile, a mile further than how I would usually edit a writer who does not come from a disadvantaged background.
I didn't mean to imply that I felt that just because somebody has a political point of view that, and it's not expressed in an aesthetically sophisticated way, that I have contempt for that. I just meant to say that I'm confused because I'm looking for craft to convey me to something beyond myself. And I find increasingly that I'm being called to respond solely on the terms of my own experience. And that there seems to be, and I could be completely wrong about this, but there seems to be less and less interest in that transportive dimension, which is what the aesthetic craft, narrative craft has spent, that's why it exists.
I also think that there's no clear answer to your question because it depends very much on the story. There are people who can write beautifully but who have nothing to say. There are people who have an extraordinary story but don't have difficulty telling it. In that case, if the story is compelling enough, it's completely legitimate to help them tell the story. If the story is boring, but they somehow represent a community that should be there I would have more doubts. But I think it really depends on the content of the piece that you would be editing.
Anyone on trigger warnings?
Boo.
I understand why, I understand the need for them. I think as a person who has been asked to deploy them and it's sort of, to me, it reminds me of, I think we're mostly writers here. It reminds me of the point in a piece where you're writing something that involves some aspect of the criminal justice system that is still unsettled. And you have to, the piece has to go to a lawyer, or some aspect of the thing you're writing has to go to a lawyer, and you get this legal language back that has to get inserted right into the piece. And it has nothing to do with it's not written in the language you wrote it, and you can't really rewrite it too much because it has to convey information that keeps the place from getting sued. I feel like a trigger warning is an emotional version of that. And depending on how you do it and where it's deployed, it's effective. And I also am sensitive to people's sensitivities. But I don't know, I've seen some very interesting usages of them. I don't know if anybody saw Young Gene Lee's Straight White Men, which came and went, but there's a trans woman and an Indigenous American man who come out and, kind of make fun / give an actual trigger warning. And it does kind of ruin the show in a weird way because nobody's being triggered by that show, but it's sort of an attempt to sort of say to the white people in the audience that you're going to see things that are going to upset you by watching a bunch of white people. There are things that can be done with it. I just, I don't know. Sorry.
I'll just end with, at Penn, we've written about trigger warnings, and we certainly oppose any policy that requires them. If an individual professor has a reason to use them, we wouldn't say he or she should be precluded. But my bias is against. But then I heard a story, someone talking about during freshman year at Harvard, they always show Love Story, and it's kind of this big thing where all the freshmen go and the upperclassmen are kind of jeering the movie Love Story. And there's a lot of jeering and a lot of commentary, and it's sort of a famous thing. And someone was saying that her mother had just died, a few months before she started Harvard, and it would have been really good, cancer, it would have been really good before walking into the screening of Love Story to know that the people are going to be jeering and cheering, she dies, she dies, she dies. So it was dramatic. And, it sort of brought a new twist to why it might be that something that can seem ridiculous and unwarranted in a different context, actually could seem completely an understandable desire. So with that, I think that was sort of in a way the theme of this conversation of trying to unpack how so many ideas that can seem problematic, objectionable, unconscionable, when pulled apart are a little more understandable. Perhaps not that we necessarily agree, but I hope we've helped to educate one another, and I certainly have learned a lot. And if we agree on one thing, I think it's that we all like The Wire. So thank you so much.
Thank you.